Hello, welcome back to Intermediate Writing. Professor Kent Lee here. Sorry, I have a bad cold right now, so I might sound and look pretty terrible. The cold and the cold medicine. Anyway, I'm going to talk about some case study examples again. The first one, I will make all of these available on in the LMS. The first one is more business-oriented. It's about Hyundai Motors in the U.S. Some of you, well, hopefully most of you know that Hyundai Motors entered the U.S. market back around the 1980s, 1990s, and has generally done pretty well. And this is kind of a case study of Hyundai Motors in the U.S. and some of their challenges. So it spends, it's just called Hyundai Motors, and it's a pretty readable article. And again, this is one of those from a business college, a business school, so it's not a published study, it's kind of a private case study that I was able to access. So in some ways it's a bit incomplete in terms of the analysis, but it has some good information and a decent analysis. Discussion of some challenges that they had overcome and some challenges that Hyundai was facing at the time the article was written. It goes back into some of their previous challenges, starting with their entry into the market in the 1980s. And they tried to build a car factory in Quebec, Canada, and it failed. I'm not sure why. There's not much of an explanation there. I think that more explanation is needed. So that's one challenge. They tried to build a car factory in Quebec to manufacture cars for the North American market, and the factory failed. Another challenge was that even though they had pretty strong sales from the beginning, from the time they entered the U.S. market, it was perceived as a cheap brand. And I think there's some context that's helpful here, because also in the 1990s, as Eastern Europe opened, there was a country called Yugoslavia in Eastern Europe, which broke up into what's now Bosnia, Montenegro, Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, etc. Back then it was one country, and they sold a really, really cheap car. A lot of these Eastern European communist countries, before communism collapsed, they had their own car companies. The Yugo in Yugoslavia, the Yugo car company, was able to actually import its cars into America, and it was a very, very cheap car, perceived as a very cheap, low-quality car. And it was kind of an attractive car to like poor people. And it's in this context that Hyundai Motors and also Daewoo Motors, what used to be Daewoo Motors, introduced their cars into the U.S. later in the 1990s. And Daewoo did pretty well until the 1997 financial crisis, and Daewoo kind of disappeared. But Hyundai continued, of course. You know, Daewoo was kind of dissolved. I actually owned a Daewoo car in the 90s in the U.S. It was a good car, actually. It's kind of sad what happened to Daewoo Motors. But Hyundai, so it's in that context of one cheap, other cheap cars like Yugo, Hyundai, particularly what was the Elantra. They still call it the Elantra in the U.S. In Korea, it changed its name to the Avante. But even to today in the U.S., it's still called Elantra. And that was also at a time when Japanese cars were definitely popular and had a good reputation for being well made. And Japanese car companies were starting to not only selling cheaper models, kind of what we call the low-end market, but also kind of more in kind of the mid-range, mid-tier, kind of somewhat more expensive, better quality, and even the high-end markets. Japanese car makers were kind of increasing their reputation and entering to the mid-tier and high-tier quality cars. That is the really like luxury cars at the top, and kind of more reliable, bigger family cars in the middle, not just the low end as they had been known. But Hyundai was still kind of new to the American market in the 90s. And so for quite some time, they still had this reputation for being kind of good, cheap cars, really cheap quality, even though they were good, well-made cars. My family has owned, we had an Elantra here in Korea, and it is a very good car, I think. So despite their strong sales, for quite some time, they had this reputation of being a cheap car brand. Of course, the 1997 financial crisis happened, and that hurt a lot of Korean companies in the U.S. In spite of that, they continue to grow in the American market, and their reputation kind of did improve over time. However, at the time this article is written, they're facing competition from Chinese and other foreign car companies in the American market, cheaper models from other countries. In spite of their increasing reputation, the Hyundai cars were still kind of relatively undervalued and underpriced compared to, say, Japanese and American-made models in the American market. And they're also kind of competing with Kia. Kia has also been in the American market. Kia has a similar, especially at this time, had a similar reputation as Hyundai for being good, cheap cars. And Hyundai, in the American market, Hyundai has to be careful. They don't want to like really compete directly with Kia, and they don't want to like fight with Kia directly because like they're our brothers. They're from Korea too, you know. That doesn't look good, and they don't want to upset Kia owners and Kia fans either. So they had to distinguish themselves from Kia and from these newer competitors, newer, cheaper cars from other countries, increase their value and their reputation. So this article then goes into, well, within the past few years prior to this article, the response from Hyundai Motors in the U.S. One was to build a new factory in Alabama, learn from their mistakes in Quebec, and build a new factory in Alabama. This is not only to improve like production and shipping costs. It's maybe a bit cheaper to produce them in the U.S. and then you don't have to pay to ship them across the ocean. But also, it's better for the reputation if they open a car factory. And this is why a lot of foreign car companies have started to build factories in the U.S. It's not just to improve like shipping and production, but it's for the sake of reputation. It helps their reputation. But at this time, they were having some labor problems with laborers and unions, and disputes over wages at the Alabama factory. And it's not clear at this time how they would resolve that. Hopefully, they have. So the new factory has been a response. They've got to deal with labor problems there. And then they have decided to try to introduce kind of higher level or higher tier models. So Hyundai Motors also decided to introduce some higher level or higher tier. Tier is like higher tier models, fancier cars basically. And to kind of shift their market position. Yeah, they will still make Elantras. Those are great cars. They sell pretty well. But also to introduce some kind of fancier models, more expensive ones, kind of larger or more family-sized cars, or cars that have a bit more of a luxury appeal or appeal to kind of middle and higher level consumers. And that's kind of where they were at the time of this article, and I can tell you they have done it pretty well. Brands like the Sonata, very nice, fancy name. The Santa Fe, which is named for an American city, nice name. Cool sounding names for nice cars. So yeah, they have done pretty well, obviously, since then. So the article ends kind of there. But since then, of course, these newer models have been doing pretty well. So in general, this is a pretty good article. It's fairly well written, has a lot of good background information, lots of good background information, has a really detailed, it begins with a really detailed history, a fairly detailed history of the history of Hyundai Motors, and then history of Hyundai in the U.S., and how they set up their business in the U.S. and how well it's gone. I would like to see more analysis of like why, maybe consumer research or something like that, in terms of citing other consumer research by others on consumer behavior, consumer reactions, to explain why the Elantra has done well. And if you're writing maybe a follow-up article or writing more to add to this, analysis of why the Elantra, the Sonata, and the Santa Fe and other models have been doing well in the American market. What is it that appeals to consumers? Research and maybe how this has helped Hyundai's reputation in the U.S. and their market share, information on their market share, especially compared to their competitors. Next, we have an article about Busan and Busan name branding. I mentioned city branding last time, and here's an article on Busan city image and name branding. more so on the city image. This is a really good article. It's more academic than the others. It's kind of maybe more than a case study. It's more of an academic analysis of Busan's name branding and city reputation, city branding. It's a really good article. I think this is maybe one of the best articles in the lot, in the batch that I'm kind of maybe making available to you. So this article goes into some of the challenges that Busan's been facing in terms of the reputation and promoting the city. Competition with other port cities. Busan, of course, is one of the top port cities in East Asia, but they're really engaged in a lot of competition with Incheon, Shanghai, Hong Kong, and other port cities in Asia. So increasing competition, deindustrialization. So Busan used to be, I think, more of an industrial city, a lot more industry. A lot of that has left and gone to other countries. So that has in part contributed to the city's population decline, loss of heavy industry, loss of population, and some city areas are now, of course, not doing so well. A lot of old, poor neighborhoods or neighborhoods that need renewal, revitalization. This article then goes into responses, the way that not only the city government, but the city in general has responded, primarily by focusing on soft power. So soft power is a really key term when you're talking about branding, especially branding of like cities and regions and countries. So there's hard power, which is a nation's kind of economic and military power, or political. It's hard political power, like if the U.S. government doesn't like your government, and it really doesn't like your government, well, hey, we can invade you. And yeah, that's sadly what the U.S. is, or just assassinate your leader. Sadly, the U.S. has done that in the past. It leads to hard power, but it's not good for soft power. It kind of gives people a bad image or bad impression of your country. In some ways, the U.S. has done well in terms of soft power, thanks to the entertainment that we export. So I think the U.S. is kind of controversial. People have really strong positive and negative feelings toward the U.S. Well, of course, Busan doesn't have an army and such, so that's not relevant. The wise thing to do for a city is to focus on soft power. Not so much the economy. It is a bit challenging for a city to stimulate its economy, but to maybe a little easier to focus on soft power. So soft power is kind of the power of the city's, of a place's reputation, whether it's a city or a region, a province, or country. People like it and respect it because it has a really positive reputation as being nice or friendly or a cool place to visit or a great place to live, or they do great things to help others. And yes, in the past, the U.S. has also gained soft power by just helping other countries a lot. It's done a lot of harm, it's done a lot of good. Well, a city can focus directly on branding efforts, advertising slogans, silly slogans like what the city of Seoul has done. I think Busan has used the slogan Dynamic Busan. Okay, it's not bad. But also, the city has focused more on developing soft power. So, for example, developing cultural attractions, such as the Busan International Film Festival. Not that the city started it, but the city has kind of helped to promote it. Promoting tourism and tourist attractions and advertising, cultural sites, and environmental improvements. So cultural environmental tourist sites like parks, Simingongwan, Dakdonggongwan, and such. Infrastructure projects, some community improvement projects to improve certain neighborhoods and communities. Those contribute to soft power. Those are things that contribute to a city's reputation, a positive reputation. That's not tied directly to economic or military power. Military is not relevant to maybe a city, but not so much as direct economic power, but it's kind of cultural and reputation power, cultural and social influence and prestige. Prestige, I think, is a good term. That would attract people to want to come here as tourists, for conferences, for business purposes, or to come and move here. God knows I like living in Busan. I like Seoul, but I like Busan is such a better place to live, I think. It's sort of, I think that Busan, I think the city Busan maybe doesn't realize how attractive the city is. It really is attractive. So the article goes into suggestions. Then, suggestions focusing on improving livability, living conditions, including more urban renewal, more like community improvement projects, more cultural projects. And certainly I think that's a good recommendation. So improving livability, and then addressing what they call political factors. And so I think one of the last paragraphs in the article talks about how some political leaders in this area have not really done enough to fight for the city's interests, especially when it comes to getting funding from the national government. And Busan needs maybe more investment, more funding from the national government for things like infrastructure, more infrastructure improvement, more community improvement projects. And this article points out that local politicians have maybe been more interested in in just serving the interests of their political party, the ideas of their political party, rather than fighting for Busan. I don't know enough about that, but I know how politics works, and yeah, that makes sense. A lot of politicians are dumb, and they care more about their party politics or ideology than serving the people. So those are the main suggestions it talks about. So this is kind of a nice case study. It's maybe a little bit different from the other case studies because it's not just focusing on strictly the Busan city government, largely, but not entirely on the city government in its efforts to brand and promote Busan, but kind of focuses on the whole metropolitan area of Busan, the city as a whole. It's a very well done article. It's a very solid academic article. It might be a little hard for some of you, but it's a very solid academic article. The next article deals with a child protection agency in the Netherlands. So this is it's called Child Protect. This is one of several agencies that work with the government to provide family services, help to children and families that are having difficulties, that need intervention from the government or sometimes from the police. So the problem with this particular child welfare agency here was problems with its budget. Its services for families, or they're called clients here, the families and the children being served by this agency, really were lacking in their effectiveness. And so with a change in leadership, a new leader, came some changes as the new leader decided to reform this particular agency. So the article focuses on changes that the leader made in terms of the administration, streamlining or simplifying administration, procedures, paperwork, reforming the way that cases were assigned to caseworkers, in the reporting that they were required to do, simplifying the paperwork that caseworkers had to do, making the paperwork actually more effective and more reasonable, and giving caseworkers more flexibility, and trying to improve their working relationship with the Dutch governments, the governments in Holland. And this led to a number of positive results, which they measured in terms of client satisfaction, how well are clients happy with the services, and also an amount of cooperation with clients, because sometimes, you have like bad parents who don't want to cooperate with, child welfare agencies or with the police. And it's also measured in terms of amount of intervention, like if parents are really not following really crucial advice or instructions from, caseworker, in a way that maybe endangers the children's, maybe they have to call the police. And so reduced reliance on police. They didn't have to call the police as often. That's another kind of metric or measure of how effective changes were at this agency, and then reducing costs. The overall costs went down. They were more effectively able to serve their clients more effectively, more efficiently and reduce costs. And this article concludes with some remaining challenges, like dealing with their other counterpart organizations, other similar agencies that were not as easy to deal with. Nice article. It's a really nice, hopeful case study of reforms in the child protection, child welfare agency. Next, we have an educational example, and that's the case of Bridge International Academies. These are kind of private schools for kids in Kenya and Uganda and other African countries. So it goes into, first of all, the history and the needs. Why was this private school established? In case you don't know, in various African countries, they do have public education in some places for children, primary and secondary school. Some places they don't, and often these are oftentimes private schools fill the gap. But either way, as this article points out, like for example in Kenya, the person who later founded this academy realized just how poor public education or education was in Kenya. Both the private education systems serving children in Kenya and public education systems in Kenya had serious problems. Ineffective, poor teaching, poor teachers, a number of other problems are described. So the company founders, they wanted to start their own kind of private school system to serve the needs of kids. And a lot of families are willing to pay that, even though they're poor. They can, they can do that. So the company founders first did some field research. They surveyed parents in different communities and found out about their needs, the kids' needs, and they sought some startup capital, some investment to get their business going. And then the challenges are discussed. Local laws, dealing with various local laws in Kenya regarding education or building a new school building or things like that, are a challenge in any country. The developing curriculum materials, when it's dealing with a lot of poor areas. So they kind of outsourced a lot of their work of developing educational materials to experts from other countries for use in classrooms in Kenya. And relying on IT, various technologies to reduce costs too, to make it possible to serve a lot of children in a poor country. Business model, which business model? Do we want to make it non-profit or a for-profit? And they decided to go with a for-profit model, sort of like a hagwon in Korean, but this is actually a regular school for kids, private schools for kids, primary, secondary schools for kids. So they went with a for-profit business model, thinking it would be easier, and other schools have done so in Africa. And then the scale. It has to, once you start, they start with maybe one school or a few schools, so then they wanted to scale up because they wanted to serve like a lot of communities throughout Kenya and other countries. So scale. So they needed to scale up their operations and remain profitable. Profitable not because they're greedy and they want to make a lot of money, but they want this to work, to succeed, so they can serve children. Increasingly more and more children throughout Africa. So I think their motives are fine. They're not going with a for-profit model because they're greedy, but because it's better to make this thing work so that they can serve more and more poor children. Solutions are discussed then. They went with kind of a very standardized, vertically integrated system. So like the head of the company is pretty much going to provide a lot of the standards and directions for classroom teaching. So it's pretty kind of vertically integrated, kind of like a top-down model. You have like the headquarters, and the company leaders, and then all of the schools spread throughout the country, very vertical, very standardized. So everything, all the classrooms are going to be pretty standardized, so that the same things are being pretty much taught in this 6th grade class here and here and here and here. So relying also on technology. So they relied on a lot of technology in order to make things cheaper, in order to save costs and money. There's relying on local labor for constructing school buildings, and then finding qualified people in the community to hire as teachers, like people who had graduated high school or college, who could be reliable teachers. Because one of the problems discussed in the article in the background section was lack of quality teachers who were qualified, or even teachers who even in other schools, teachers wouldn't even show up for class. So they wanted to hire qualified local teachers who would teach their courses. They set up, along with technology, they set up an e-payment system. There was an electronic payment system already in use, commonly used in the country, that they could make use of. And this is advantageous because the article talked about the problems of political corruption and making payments. So if they relied on an electronic payment system, and the average Kenyan parent could use their smartphone to make payments, or the administrators of the school can rely on this electronic payment system, they can kind of get around like politicians who want bribes and such. They can say, sorry, our smartphone app doesn't have a bribe function. Sorry. So they relied on an e-payment system and other technology. They created an academy to recruit and train teachers. So hiring local teachers and then training them at their training academy before sending them to the classrooms. And then, along with the vertical integration, prepared lessons. So they created a lot of pre-prepared lessons. Again, maybe these are relatively new teachers and they're serving a huge community. They want to scale it up to serve more and more communities over time. The easiest way is to create prepared lessons. These are some prepared lessons for 5th grade and for 6th grade. Different semesters and different days of different semesters for different grades. But it's not all artificial, because there is time in the class for class discussion. So the teacher has prepared materials to go through, and then time for class discussion. So it's not all there is a potential criticism of, is this being too teacher-centered, too traditional, too much traditional teaching style, not good. But they allow time for class discussion, then for teachers to interact with the children. That is where the company is at the time this article is written. It'd be interesting to know how this company has been doing since then, but it seems like they are providing a really good service for kids in Africa. Some ideas for you. I hope these ideas help. Again, these articles will be available in the LMS. I might make some other examples available too for you. So next time I'll talk a little bit more about case studies, or let's see, in the coming lectures, I've got to talk about a little bit more about persuasive papers and a few more things about case studies, and some stuff about common problems in the midterm, essays that I read, and we'll talk also about problems with logic and making things more persuasive later on. But I hope these are some good examples for you, to give you some ideas about how to do your final paper. So the last week of lectures this semester, I'm going to talk about another form of the Chicago style. Talk about maybe some other aspects of language use and expressions, maybe. The last day will be another sort of office hour day, where I won't have a lecture, but I will say I'll be in Zoom. Come into my Zoom session and tell me about your project, your final project, and how it's going. Ask me questions. That will be the last kind of class day of the semester, aside from makeup lectures for the Chuseok and other holidays we had before. Those lectures I've already done. Those were kind of scheduled into the days for those holidays in the LMS. So aside from that, the last lecture will be a sort of office hour kind of meeting time for you to come in and talk to me. So hope this helps. Good luck with your final papers and other assignments. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.